Welcome to today's Astrobiology Colloquium. In this first session, we have our own graduate students talking about their rotation research. Next week, we have the director of the Nice Observatory, France, who's going to talk about signs of habitability on exoplanets and icy moons, that kind of thing. And then after that, third week, we have someone talking about a solution to the problem of chirality in biomolecules based on some new work. Then after that, I can't remember the sequence, so that I can only go out that far. But at this point, we have, let me introduce, this is Sam Gilbert. I'm sure people know her, a graduate student in astronomy. And she's going to talk about outgassing on exoplanets. Yeah. And then
One exit.
One exit. Okay, I thought you might generalize it, but that's fine. And then Josh Sachs from Oceanography is going to talk about his rotation, which was on agnostic biosignatures, right? Okay, so let's go. Take it away.
Yay, okay. For the folks on Zoom, just to check really fast, can you see the slides and can you hear me okay? I just want to do a thumbs up emoji. Yep. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Sam. I use she, her pronouns. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the research rotation that I did at Stanford University with Professor Laura Schaefer. And my project was to predict outgassing rates for a small rocky planet called L9859b using a planetary interior thermal evolution model. First, I just want to shout out Laura Schaefer, who is my rotation advisor. She was a really awesome mentor. She's a great scientist, also just a really lovely person, and I'm really grateful to her for hosting me in her lab for an entire quarter. Just a little bit about Laura. She's an assistant professor of Earth and planetary sciences at the Stanford Door School, and she primarily studies atmosphere and interior exchange on rocky planets, both in our solar system, but also beyond it, so exoplanets. And to do this work, she and her group have developed multiple models, magma ocean model, atmospheric model, internal structure model, to simulate planets as they evolve through time. And I got to spend my rotation working on one of these models. Okay, so it's kind of almost a meme at this point to start a talk with this, but it's cliched because it's true, which is that JWST has really initiated this era of characterizing the atmospheres of rocky exoplanets for the very first time, where we could detect planets and measure their physical characteristics like mass and radius. Now we can really gain insight into the processes that are actually happening on them in their atmospheres, maybe even on their surfaces, and maybe even below their surfaces in their interiors. So one of the ways that we can use JWST to learn about rocky planet atmospheres is via a technique called thermal emission spectroscopy. So here we have a little diagram of physically what is happening when we measure a thermal emission spectrum. So let me see, you can see my cursor. Nope, that's fine. Okay, so when the planet crosses in front of the star, so that's the little red dot with the blue around it there. Most people know this as a transit. We all love transits. At shorter wavelengths in the near infrared, this is where we would see the light from the star kind of filter through the prism of the planet's atmosphere on its way to us, and that's how we get a transmission spectrum. But at longer wavelengths, we can also see the heat signature that's coming off of the planet itself. And this is what we call the thermal emission. So the way that this works is after the planet crosses in front of the star, when it's kind of to the side there, we get two signals together. We get a signal from the star, but we also get the heat signature coming off of the planet. When the planet passes behind the star, this is the secondary eclipse, the signal from the planet effectively disappears behind the star. So the heat signature from the planet appears, and then it disappears, and that allows us to remove the star from the total signal so that you can isolate and measure the thermal emission spectrum of the planet. And the strength of the thermal emission signal, so how observable it is to us, is strongly related to how much heat is actually coming off of the planet. So this technique tends to work best for planets that are hotter. So frequently this is planets that are closer into their stars because they're receiving more stellar radiation. So here's an example of a recent thermal emission measurement from JWST. It used the MIRI instrument to measure the heat signature of TRAPPIST-1b. And this is a really exciting early JWST science result because the TRAPPIST system has several Earth-sized rocky planets that people are really interested in studying to discover if they're habitable or maybe even if they have life on them. So here you can see the data point that they measured. It's the one smack dab in the middle. And they show that this one data point is consistent with, they say, little or no planetary atmosphere redistributing radiation from the host star, and also no detectable atmospheric absorption of carbon dioxide or other species. So what this means is they were able to basically use this one single data point and this thermal emission observation to conclude that this planet TRAPPIST-1b is most likely a bare rock without any sort of atmosphere. One data point. And the way that they interpret this one data point is by using different atmospheric models with various assumptions in these models to try and fit the data. So you get models that don't fit the data that suggest that those kinds of atmospheres don't really apply to this planet, while the models that do successfully fit the data represent plausible atmospheres that could exist on the planet. So in this case, the pink line and the blue line represents kind of a Venus-like carbon dioxide dominated atmosphere. The pink line represents still a thick atmosphere, but not as thick as Venus's oxygen and CO2 atmosphere. Neither of these lines go through our data point, so probably the planet does not have an atmosphere like that. But two lines that do go through the data point are black bodies. So basically, if the planet just absorbed radiation and then re-radiated it out to space, due to the absence of an atmosphere, those fit our data point. Okay, but before we can choose what kinds of atmospheric models are reasonable to try to fit to data like this, we need models that simulate the planetary interior first. So planetary interior models simulate how the heat and the material inside of the planet ultimately makes it out of the interior to create the conditions that we get to observe on the planet. So we use these interior models to predict outgassing rates, aka how much stuff like CO2 comes out of the planetary interior to potentially form an atmosphere. These kinds of models are also really, really useful for predicting the temperatures that we might expect to see on these planets as well, which is also really helpful for informing atmospheric models. But of course, planets come in all shapes and sizes. So this means planets could have all kinds of possible interior structures. So for example, to start with the Earth, we know it has plate tectonics. I assume most of you know what this means, but just to review, this means our crust is broken up into these big pieces that are mobile and move around on top of the mantle and sometimes collide with each other. And below these plates, we have a semi-liquid but mostly solid mantle that convects heat. And below that mantle, we have a core containing radioactive material that also helps generate heat to the entire planet. And we think plate tectonics on Earth play a pretty important role in keeping our climate stable over long geological timescales. And this is because of how plate tectonics facilitate the carbon cycle on our planet. So where plates come together at plate boundaries, material from the mantle like CO2, CO, H2, water can make it out of the inside of the planet and into the atmosphere or onto the surface. Plate boundaries at mid-ocean ridges are super important because material doesn't just leave the mantle at these locations, it can also go back into the interior or subduct. So this means over long periods of time, the Earth effectively has kind of an internal thermostat that helps it regulate the amount of carbon in the atmosphere by either outgassing carbon from the interior or subducting it right back in. And since carbon is a greenhouse gas, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere matters a lot for the climate. So for some reason, it's even theorized that plate tectonics could potentially be a requirement for habitable planets. In fact, I think the first Astrobiology Colloquium I ever saw was on that very topic, so it's kind of nice. Okay, but at the same time, we know that not all planets have plate tectonics because we've studied the other rocky planets in our own solar system. So in contrast to plate tectonics, Mars and Venus, at least at the present day, so far as we can tell, have what's called a stagnant lid. So given two of our rocky planets are in this stagnant lid regime, It's theorized that stagnant lid planets could be way more common in the universe than plate tectonic planets like Earth. So it's really important to understand how the stagnant lid impacts a planet's interior atmosphere evolution when we want to try to make predictions for rocky exoplanets that may ultimately be very diverse. So in contrast to plate tectonics, which is what we have on the left diagram, a stagnant lid, which is the diagram on the right, is like one solid plate that surrounds the entire planet. So we don't have moving pieces floating on top of the mantle, but the stagnant lid can get thicker and thinner over time, depending on the heat, the flow of heat in the mantle below it. And I've heard people compare this to like a soup kind of congealing a little layer on top as it cools. But the stagnant lid itself isn't really moving around. So stagnant lids don't have plate boundaries. And we kind of established that mid-ocean ridges, plate boundaries on Earth are kind of two-way streets where material can go into and out of the mantle. But with a stagnant lid, the only way material can make it out of the interior is really via extrusive volcanic eruptions. And this is more like a one-way street. There's material coming out, but it's really not going to go back in through the volcano. Also, if you're only able to outgas material via eruptions because you don't have plate boundaries, you're also going to be much less efficient at pumping material out from the interior than in the plate tectonic case. So there's some interesting differences. So when we want to model the interiors of exoplanets, we definitely want to consider the thermal mechanics of the stagnant lid planet and not just assume that the planet has Earth-like plate tectonics. And we want to simulate how this impacts the thermal evolution of the planet and the outgassing of different molecules like CO2, which help regulate climate. Okay, so my job in my rotation project was to take the existing thermal evolution model, which assumes plate tectonics, and modify it so that it could also simulate a stagnant lid planet. So the way that a model like this works is you basically solve energy and mass balance equations at each boundary in the system. So there's a boundary between the core and the mantle. There's a boundary between the mantle and the crust. And at each boundary, energy and material get exchanged. So what the model helps us do is keep track of how much heat and how much CO2, CO, water, H2 moves through the system, while also ensuring, of course, that we conserve mass and energy so that we don't violate the laws of physics. But we don't just solve these equations once. All of these processes change over time. So for example, the flow of heat is a time-dependent process. Eruption and outgassing are time-dependent processes, and so on and so forth. So this means that what we have to do is let this entire system evolve over many time steps to understand how it changes over time. And generally, we'll evolve a planet on the order of billions of years. For reference, Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So this is generally why we choose something on the order of like 10 to the 9 years. Okay, so to take the first steps to allow the model to simulate a planet with a stagnant lid, I modified the model to only calculate outgassing via extrusive eruptions. So we no longer have material coming out of the mid-ocean ridges since we don't have those anymore. And for now, I turned off subduction since we don't have those plate boundaries where material can get reburied. There are theoretically other kind of more exotic ways that a stagnant lid can rebury material, but we're neglecting that for now, and it would be a step later to add that. Okay, we decided to apply our model to the planet L9859b. It's an exciting upcoming target for characterization with JWST thermal emission. In fact, I think it was granted time in cycle 2. So probably those observations should happen soon if they haven't happened already. It's a rocky planet about 35 light years away from us, orbiting an M star. It's an inner planet of the system, so its orbital period's pretty short and it's pretty close to the star. And thanks to prior measurements, we know it's about half the mass of the Earth and 85% of its size, give or take uncertainties. And from model predictions, we think it probably has an equilibrium temperature of 558 Kelvin based on its proximity to the star. So pretty toasty. So this means even if the planet doesn't have an atmosphere, it's going to be pretty hot just by virtue of how much energy it's receiving from its star. So this means we can probably expect a decently observable heat signature from this planet, which is why it's such an interesting thermal emission target. So even though we do have mass and radius measurements, they have associated uncertainties, just like any measurement. And these uncertainties are big enough that we ultimately can't really say that much right now about the planet's composition just based on its density alone. The density with uncertainties covers a wide range of possible materials, so really we don't have any help constraining that with these measurements. So to review, we know Earth has plate tectonics. We know our mantle is oxidized, which means it's got a lot of available oxygen to pair with other elements and make things like CO and CO2. And lastly, we know it's got about 1 Earth ocean's worth of water. For L9859b, though, we do not know what this planet is like. We don't know if it has plate tectonics or stagnant lid. We don't know if its mantle is oxidized like the Earth's, or potentially more reducing or potentially more oxidizing. And we don't know how much water it could have in its interior or on its surface. So we want to try to model a planet for which there are a ton of unknowns. How do you go about doing this? The solution is to try all different kinds of combinations of parameters to try to get at the wide range of conditions that could exist on the planet. So in this study, we vary 2 things: the redox state of the mantle and the initial water mass fraction. So the redox state of the mantle quantifies how reducing or oxidizing it is compared to the Earth's mantle. So negative numbers here are more reducing than the Earth's mantle, and positive numbers are more oxidizing. And a reducing mantle just means we tend to have more hydrogen available to combine with other elements in the environment, while an oxidizing mantle has more oxygen available. So for a reducing mantle where more hydrogen is available to combine with other stuff, we tend to get reduced molecules like H2 or methane, if that was in the model, for example. For an oxidizing mantle where more oxygen is available to combine with the other stuff around it, we tend to get oxidized molecules like CO2. So the redox state of the mantle is going to dictate how much oxidized stuff like CO2 versus reduced stuff like H2 makes it out of the planet's interior and into its atmosphere. The other parameter that we vary is the initial water mass fraction. And this is just quantifying how much water the planet starts out with. The Earth has a water mass fraction of about 10 to the minus 4. So we can try planets with diminished water mass fractions or planets with enriched water mass fractions compared to the Earth to kind of cover our bases. So I think we try as little as about 1,000th of an Earth ocean and as much as 1,000 Earth oceans. So a very generous range. Okay, so one of the really helpful things that the model outputs is how much water should end up on the surface of the planet, given how much water we started out with. So we find that unless there are 100 to 1,000 Earth oceans initially on L9859b, it's really not going to be able to sustain water on its surface over 5 billion years. Intuitively, I think this makes sense for an inner planet. We wouldn't necessarily consider it or assume that it would be holding on to a lot of water. If we assume the planet has an Earth-like water mass fraction, we can see how different mantle redox states impact the CO2 outgassing rate. So the black dotted line is the Earth CO2 outgassing rate as a basis for comparison, and then the different colored lines are different mantle redox states. So the green line has a mantle redox state of 3. That's much more oxidizing than the Earth's mantle. 0 is as oxidizing as the Earth's mantle, and then -1 and -2 are more reducing. So we find that if you assume an Earth-like water mass fraction, or about 1 Earth ocean, L9859b would have to have a much more oxidizing mantle to produce the kind of CO2 outgassing rates that we see on Earth. By contrast, we can crank down the water mass fraction to be about 10% of Earth's. So that's like if we had 1/10 of an Earth ocean. And in this case, no matter how oxidizing the mantle is, we don't come close to producing similar CO2 outgassing rates to Earth. I think this result makes sense because less water available means you also have a smaller inventory of oxygen overall. And that's an ingredient that you need to make CO2. If we go the other direction and crank up the water content to 10 Earth oceans, then we can get Earth-like CO2 outgassing rates with a mantle that is more comparably oxidizing to Earth, so we don't need to make it super, super oxidizing. And if we crank up the water content even higher to 100 Earth oceans, then we can get Earth-like CO2 outgassing rates with either a reducing or an oxidizing mantle relative to the Earth. However, I do want to note there's kind of an odd model behavior happening here. We're at about 10 million years. All the outgassing rates kind of fall off. I'm not sure why that's happening, and it's something I would want to investigate further, given more time to work on this project. Okay, the last plot I'll show you is the predicted surface temperature for this planet, which we calculated using the partial pressure of CO2 that makes up the atmosphere given the outgassing rates that we calculated over the planet's evolution. Okay, and what this plot shows you is no matter what you choose for your initial water content, so whether we start with an 1,000th of an Earth ocean or 1,000 Earth oceans, the planet seems to pretty much always end up at a surface temperature of about 900 Kelvin by 5 billion years. And given the other model behaviors I've noticed, I'm not 100% sure that I trust this result. But if we take it at face value, we can compare it to the predicted equilibrium temperature from the paper that I mentioned before. And 900 Kelvin is much hotter than the predicted equilibrium temperature of 558 Kelvin. I think this means, if you take this result at face value, that you would be able to detect even a pretty thin atmosphere and thermal emission on this planet because of the potentially very large difference in expected and measured planet temperature. We showed that, if you have different water mass fractions, different mantle redox states, you get different CO2 outgassing rates, but in the end, that doesn't actually seem to matter for the temperature that you would measure if the planet manages to retain any amount of CO2. Okay. So what we found is that L9859b would probably need to have 100 to 1,000 times the amount of water on Earth to retain surface oceans after 5 billion years. To produce Earth-like CO2 outgassing rates, it would need to either one Earth ocean and a really, really oxidizing mantle, or 1,000 Earth oceans with a reducing or modestly oxidizing mantle compared to the Earth. The surface temperature we predict is significantly warmer than the predicted equilibrium temperature, which could mean that even relatively thin CO2 atmospheres could be observable with JWST thermal emission. Overall, though, I think I would want to continue debugging and validating the model behavior just to make sure I fully understand everything that's happening in the model and to make sure that the changes I made didn't break things inside it. Other than that, I think other future work that could be interesting is adding a regassing mechanism so that carbon can get reburied into the interior and see how that changes the balance of things over time. And I think it could also be interesting to vary over the uncertainty in the mass and the radius from the radial velocity measurements to see how that impacts the interior atmosphere evolution. Thank you.
Well, you can take some questions.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying to Josh, we're going to switch over the laptops too, but yeah, please do ask questions. Yeah.